Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon at long last. I know I haven't posted anything on this channel for like a really long time, but it's been kind of crazy. I've been doing a lot of stuff over on the 13 o'clock channel, and then we had holidays and various family things, so I haven't really got around to it, but I'm finally getting around to doing this now, and I'm finally returning to my night gallery breakdowns that I'm doing in 6 episode chunks. Now, before, I can't remember how long ago it was. Yeah, I had done season 2, episodes 1 through 6. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the next half dozen episodes, which would be episodes 7 through 12 of Night Gallery season 2. So let's just get right into it. Now, episode 7. So the first segment of this is called Midnight Never Ends. And this one actually starts out really good. Like, it starts out really creepy and really evocative, but I feel like it doesn't quite stick the landing. I mean, it's still really good, but I kind of feel like the ending could have been better. Now, like some of the other segments and that I've talked about previously, this one was directed by a person whose name I'm sure I'm butchering. Is it Gino Schwark? I think, something like that, who also directed Jaws 2, among other things, and did like a bunch of these segments as well. So what happens in Midnight Never Ends? So there's this woman named Ruth, and she's actually played by Susan Strasberg, who was in The Manitou, who I actually reviewed, a movie which is kind of batshit insane, that I actually reviewed over on 13 o'clock. So please check that out if you don't mind. Now, she's kind of in this car, and she's driving down this really long, lonely road at night. There's no other cars, there's no signs, there's no lights, there's no towns or anything like that. She just seems like she's driving in a void, you know what I mean? So she happens to pass this hitchhiker, who turns out to be a young man named Vincent, who's actually played by Robert F. Lyons, who was in Dark Knight of the Scarecrow, which is really good, among other things. I think we reviewed that one a while back, too. And he's wearing, like, a Marine's uniform, and he's holding a sign that says Pendleton on it. So she kind of passes him, and then she's kind of like, should I not? I mean, it's the 70s. People are picking up hitchhikers. Nowadays, people be like, fuck that. It's probably a serial killer, so you'd never pick him up. But she's just like, I'll pick him up. So she backs up, and he gets in the car. So he starts asking her, like, a bunch of questions, like, are you going to LA, blah, blah, blah. But she kind of seems hesitant to reply, almost because, not that she's being a bitch or anything, but it's like almost like she doesn't really know the answers, or she can't really remember the answers, you know what I mean? At one point, Vincent starts, like, whistling a tune, and Ruth asks him, man, what is that? Because I've had that tune stuck in my head, like, this whole drive. And he says, that's impossible because I wrote that song. Like, I have a guitar with me, and it's like I like to write songs. That's what I want to do with my life after I get out. And she says, get out of what? I mean, it seems obvious that he means get out of the military because of the uniform and everything. But then after she asks him that, he kind of pauses, and he's just like, I don't really know. I don't remember what I'm going to get out of. So there's that. So as the drive goes on, they just pass no other cars. There's nothing on either side of the road. Like I said, it's just like they're in this black void. They also start to realize that they already know each other's names, and they already have a good idea of what's going to happen next, even though supposedly they've never met before, right? Which is a great premise. I mean, it's super creepy and, like, super weird, because you're just like, the whole time you're like, what the fuck is going on? You know what I mean? Like, for example, as an example of, them knowing what's going to happen, they both foresee that there's going to be a diner coming up on one side of the road, and they're going to stop there for coffee, and they both already know that the place is going to be closed, but that the owner will let them in anyway, even though he, like, won't be happy about it. And this exact thing happens. The diner is called the Blue Danube, and, the owner, who's this real crotchety dude, he lets them inside after Vincent says, hey, it's not closing time yet because the place is supposed to close at midnight. He's like, yes, it is. He looks back at the wall. There's no clock. And then he looks back at the wall again. Now there is a clock, but it's 10 till. He's like, oh, I guess you're right. So he has to let him in. You know what I mean? So once they're inside the diner, both Ruth and Vincent get accused of being kind of like freaks or hippies or whatever because of the, like, weird and seemingly psychic shit that they're saying. But it comes to pass that as they're talking to this kind of surly diner owner, that he doesn't really remember shit about himself either. Like, not even his own military record or how many people he served in the diner that day. Like, what was the special, blah, blah. And he's just like, shit, I don't know. You know what I mean? So again, like a really weird premise, because you're just like, oh my God, what the fuck is going on here? So Vincent then foretells that a sheriff is going to come by, see that the diner's door is open, and is going to come inside to check and see what's going on. And again, this also happens. But just like before, when they start talking to the cop, he can't recall shit about himself either. Like, he doesn't even remember what he was doing before he got there. You know what I mean? There's also this rather strange matter of this kind of barely recognizable sound coming from somewhere above their heads that they can't figure out what it is. Now, at some stage, after a little argument, the cop shoots Vincent in the stomach, which seems a little excessive, to be honest. Right when that happens, it seems that Ruth and Vincent have like kind of started to figure out what was going on. And at that point is when the twist, if that's what you want to call it, is revealed to the audience. Now, people watching this nowadays, this many decades later, will probably guess the outcome of this because it's been done before. Probably the most notable one that I thought of first was in a Twilight Zone episode, actually from 1961, which was called 5 Characters in Search of an Exit. So this is kind of the same deal. All of these people are obviously characters in a story, and the frustrated writer, who's played by the same actor that's playing Vincent, is kind of having trouble figuring out what he wants to do with these characters, like, hence why they're foggy about details about their lives, because he hasn't really figured the shit out yet. So it turns out that he's used all of these characters in other of his stories before, but he can't quite decide like how they're all going to fit into the present story or what's going to happen to them or anything like that. The sound that they were all hearing while they were in universe was the clicking of the typewriter keys. And then at the end of the segment, the story essentially like starts over again. Like, Ruth is driving down a road, but she's driving a different car this time because the story changed, you know what I mean? And she picks Vincent up again. I think he's wearing something else, like he's not wearing a military uniform anymore. So yeah, the implication is that these characters are caught in a kind of limbo that's not going to be resolved until the writer like sorts the shit out about what the story is going to be about. So like I said, this started out pretty great. It was kind of eerie, kind of effective. You were really kind of like, man, what the hell's going on? You know, the mystery of it was intriguing because you weren't really sure like what was going on. But then as it went on, you kind of started to figure it out. So like the ending was kind of a letdown. Like, as soon as they were in the diner and heard that noise, like, I knew what the noise was. So I was just kind of like, oh, I know where this is going, because it's just like that Twilight Zone. It's not just like that Twilight Zone episode, but it's really similar. So it's like, so I kind of called it. I kind of wish, I mean, this was a good segment. I really liked it, but I think it needed maybe just like a weirder twist, or maybe if it had the same twist, just maybe like a punchier ending, because it seemed a little anticlimactic. That's all I'm saying. So the next story is called Brenda. Now, this is based on a short story by Margaret St. Clair, who I think I mentioned her before. She wrote a great story called The Estuary, which I don't think they ever made an adaptation of, but it was in Alfred Hitchcock Presents Stories That Scared Even Me, which I talk about that anthology all the time because I really like it a lot. But yeah, so she wrote this story that this was based on. This was directed by somebody named Alan Reisner. I can't say I was too big of a fan of this one. The main protagonist of it was just this insufferable brat, and you know, it's the audience is supposed to obviously feel sympathy for her, but you kind of don't, because she's terrible. I liked the premise, but I kind of felt like it took too long to get where it was going, and again, like the last one, ended kind of anticlimactically. So what you have in this one, the actress Laurie Prange, I guess, is how you pronounce her last name. She plays the title character, Brenda, obviously. She was kind of like, I guess she's supposed to be about 12 years old. And she's staying on an island with her family, like for summer vacation. Now, at the beginning of the story, Brenda sees another girl her age, who is presumably also having a vacation there with her family, who's like playing on the beach next to this really rad like sand castle that the girl built, right? So Brenda, very deliberately, after making these really weird I can't really explain what she does, but she's kind of make the like a vrooming kind of sound, sort of like she's gearing up for something, and she starts like doing her arms around like that, like I don't know what the fuck she's doing. It's really bizarre. But yeah, so she starts doing that, and then stomps over and then, you know, very deliberately like flattens the sandcastle, right? Seemingly just to be an asshole. I mean, exactly just to be an asshole. I think that's why. So the girl who built the sandcastle is, understandably really upset about this. It's like, what the fuck? Why are you just like stepping on my sandcastle? Oh, I didn't even see it there. You know what I mean? It was that kind of shit, even though there's like literally nobody else on the beach anywhere. As this goes on, it's kind of revealed that Brenda has essentially alienated every other kid on the island because she's just such a horrid little shit that does crap like this all the time. Brenda just like does not seem to give one single fuck though. I mean, she just seems to like be drifting through life with that grating laugh and just kind of acting like a loner sociopath all the time. So while Brenda is kind of frittering around in the woods on the same day, she comes across, just randomly, some kind of creature that kind of looks like someone in a ghillie suit had a baby with Sigmund the sea monster by way of Swamp Thing. You know what I mean? It kind of looks like that. So this creature kind of chases her around. I was kind of hoping it was going to eat her, but it doesn't. Spoiler alert. She doesn't get eaten, unfortunately. But yeah, so she hides from it for a little while, but then she decides, hey, I haven't done enough shitty things today, so I'm going to, cause this. Essentially, it seems like a harmless monster. Yeah, it's chasing her, but, I don't think it would have done anything bad, maybe. It doesn't do anything bad to anybody, like, over the course. So she causes the monster to fall into a quarry that it can't really get out of, like this kind of deep ravine type situation. So she's really amused by this situation. She does seem interested in the monster, though, which I guess you would be because it's a monster. She's kind of asking it like how it got to the island and blah blah. But then she decides, well, fuck it, and she's just gonna leave this monster stuck down in this ravine, like I said, that it can't get out of. So it's just kind of like, man, Brenda, get fucked, you know what I mean? She's such a dick. So then later we see Brenda's dad, who's actually played by Glenn Corbett, who played Zephram Cochrane on the original Star Trek series, because I was like, hey, I recognized him like immediately. But yeah, he plays her dad, and he yells at her for being such a douche, which, that's legit. And he makes her go apologize to the parents of the little girl whose sandcastle she stomped on. So she doesn't want to do it, obviously. She's like, but I'm an asshole, just let me be me. She doesn't say that, but you know what I mean. So, but she does do it, like very grudgingly. And she even tries to get the girl, I can't remember what the girl's name was, or even if they said. She tries to get the girl to come to the ravine to see the monster, presumably. I don't know if she's going to feed the girl to the monster. That sounds like some shit she would do, but I don't really know. Maybe she's just trying to impress her. But the girl just, very wisely, like, blows her off. She's like, no, I'd rather stay here and do housework. And I was just like, woo, harsh, but fair. You know what I mean? So Brenda goes back to visit the monster and asks it more questions about, its origins and stuff, which of course it doesn't answer because, it's a sentient pile of seaweed and they generally can't talk. So there's that. So finally, though, she seems to feel maybe slightly a little bit bad about trapping this creature down in this hole and sort of says, okay, well, I guess to be magnanimous, I'll like try to help the monster out. But then it kind of starts to climb out on its own. And then she's like, oh shit. And then like she wigs out and like hauls ass away from there. Right. Now, later on, she's laying in bed in their, house they're staying in, and she overhears her parents talking about her. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but I'm presuming they're like, why is our daughter such an asshole? You know what I mean? It's like, what are we going to do? Are we going to sell her to the circus, or, I don't know, take her to an orphanage, drop her off a cliff? I don't know. So whatever they said about her kind of pisses her off. So after they've kind of retired for the night, she goes downstairs and leaves the front door cracked open, I'm presuming so that the monster can come in there and fuck him up, you know what I mean? Because that's some shit that Brenda would do. Now, the monster does indeed take the bait and, like, come inside the house. And Brenda's mom and dad, like, try to hold it off. They're, like, calling the neighbor, bring the shotgun, and all this other kind of stuff. Now, the neighbor does come over with the shotgun, but says, bro, like, the monster was at my house, too, and it's like, I tried shooting with a shotgun and it didn't do jack, so you're kind of on your own. But then it turns out that the adults must have maybe found some way to subdue the monster, at least, because the next morning, Brenda goes out and finds this huge pile of rocks, almost like a cairn or something, like at the bottom of the ravine. And we're led to assume that the remains of the monster are under all of these rocks, right? I don't know why the parents would be out there in the middle of the night just piling rocks on top of it. I don't get it. But maybe they had to do that to, like, constrain it because they couldn't shoot it. I don't really know. I didn't get it. So there's that. So Brenda now feels really bad, and then she vows, I will be back again next summer You're my only friend and I love you. And I'm like, sorry, what? Like, what are you, like, where did that come from? I don't really know. So then they kind of jump ahead a year to the following summer. She comes back with her family to the island. The rock pile is still there, and you're led to assume that the monster is still alive under there. So she basically just like hugs the rocks and talks to the monster, saying that she's going to let him out. And that's it. Like, I get what the story was going for. Like, here's a girl who's lonely and has a hard time making friends, so she lashes out at people, which makes it even more difficult for people to relate to her. So the audience is clearly supposed to sympathize with her loneliness and maybe kind of find some poignancy in the fact that she's befriended essentially another misfit, like just this monster that ended up on this island somehow. So a story like this could absolutely work, but as I mentioned earlier, Brenda is not likable or sympathetic at all, and she just comes across like just this cruel jerk. So you don't really entirely buy it when she suddenly, you know, takes a turn and like tells the monster that she loves him and she's gonna let him out. Like, I didn't buy it, you know what I mean? The monster itself is pretty cool, but you know, I kind of like I said, he kind of looks like Sigmund the Sea Monster. He's not quite as goofy as that, but I kind of, to be honest, I kind of wish this story had ended differently. I was just kind of hoping that at the end, like, the monster would bust out of the rocks and just, like, pop her in his mouth and eat her, and then just go about his monsterly way. And I'd be just like, that would have been a happy ending. But no, that didn't happen. So I don't know if the original story, because like I said, I really do like Margaret St. Clair, who wrote the original short story this was based on. I'm sure the original story is better. This probably would have played a lot better if they either had a different actress or if the actress that played Brenda had toned down the assholery some, so you could actually see the human underneath the asshole. You know what I mean? Like, I think it would have worked a lot better, but, you know, what are you going to do? All right, so the first segment of episode 8 is called The Diary. Now, this one was written by Rod Serling and directed by William Hale. This one actually pretty decent. I actually quite like this one. It had very flowery, overly expositional dialogue, but a lot of Rod Serling's scripts had that. That was kind of one of his trademarks, like, as a writer. So it's not like it's really that different from some of the other stuff, and I didn't really mind it in this context, to be honest. This one also had a really satisfying twist ending that I admit I did not see coming, which is really unusual for a lot of these, because even though a lot of these have twist endings, a lot of times you can guess them. They're telegraphed, or they've been done a lot of times before or since, so you can see what's coming. This one I didn't call it, you know, so I thought that was pretty good. So Patty Duke is in this, and she plays this real bitchy, like, I guess she's like a TV entertainment journalist type thing, and her name is Holly Schaefer. At the beginning of the story, she's on her show, like hosting her show, and she's just really laying into this kind of aging, you're led to believe kind of has-been actress by the name of Carrie Crane, who's played by Virginia Mayo. And, you know, making fun of the fact, oh my God, she just got arrested again for drunk and disorderly. Like, how embarrassing, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, Holly's rant about this poor woman is, like, fucking brutal. It's really brutal. And it's kind of later implied that there's been kind of like a personal rivalry between these two women for, like, some time. Since, you know, they kind of explain later on, the younger Holly at one point maybe stole Carrie's man. Although Holly's take on this whole thing was, and this is a quote, "Men aren't stolen, they're relinquished," which I thought was kind of funny. So it's New Year's Eve, and Holly is throwing this big, huge party at her real swanky, like, penthouse apartment. Now, Carrie shows up uninvited with this kind of like a present, wrapped, it's wrapped in gold and stuff, like, under her arm. Now, she goes to the guard at the front desk of the building, and he isn't supposed to let anybody in, but he was a fan of hers back in the day, and he's just like, oh, all right, I guess it'll be okay if you go, because I'm a big fan of yours and you guys know each other, blah, blah, blah. So she gets up to the apartment. Holly, turns out, is just as cunty as expected when Carrie, like, comes into the place. But she agrees to speak with her kind of away from the other guests and makes, like, all these jokes about bloodletting, about them killing each other and stuff like that. Now, at this point, Carrie doesn't seem mad. She just seems kind of sad. And she says, well, I don't really want to hurt you. I just wanted to give you a present. Now, Holly doesn't open it, but Carrie tells her it's a diary. And I bought it at this, what she called a funny little shop, which is filled with all kind of unusual items, which in this case you're led to believe means like cursed shit and supernatural things and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And she says she paid out the wazoo for it. Holly at this point is just kind of like, whatever, you boozed up old bat, like, get the fuck out of my apartment, right? After Carrie leaves, though, Holly gets kind of curious and opens the package. Now, inside, there's a diary, just a regular ass looking diary, just like Carrie said that there would be. But the weird thing about it is that there's an entry already written in it, dated January 1st, which obviously is the next day. And weirder than that, the entry is in Holly's handwriting, and it laments what an absolute bummer it was that Carrie committed suicide during the party and just brought the whole mood of the shindig down, right? Sure enough, a minute or two later, there's screaming, like coming from the party guests out in the main part of the apartment. Holly rushes out, looks over the balcony, like everybody else is looking over the balcony, and then Carrie is dead as vaudeville down on the street below. Now, at first, I thought she had jumped off the balcony, but it's actually established later on that she deliberately threw herself in front of a car. So she actually went back downstairs and threw herself out in the street. But it looked like she jumped off the thing. But I was like, well, she doesn't look splattered enough to, you know what I mean? I think about these kind of things. So as the story goes on, new entries start appearing in the diary that Holly's insisting that she did not write. But everything that is written in there, like, ends up coming true. Like, the phone in her apartment breaks. Like, she was talking about, oh my God, my phone is out of order or whatever. And then, like, it ends up breaking. And then she ends up having to cancel one of her shows for some reason, blah, blah, blah. So she's starting to freak out about this, as you would. And her boyfriend says, maybe you should go to a shrink because you are actually starting to believe this diary is, like, legit paranormal. And she eventually, and she's very skeptical, so she doesn't really want to believe this shit either. But she's just like, yeah, I think this shit's magic. Like, you know what I mean? Because I didn't do this. So she eventually does relent, like, all right, fine, I'll go see a shrink if it'll make you happy. So she goes and visits a psychiatrist whose name is Dr. Mill. Dr. Mill seems to think that probably Holly is writing the stuff in the diary herself, like while she's in some kind of weird fugue state. And he says, and I think that you're going into those kind of fugue states. He doesn't use these words, but he basically says because you're filled with guilt because you're such a nasty twat. You know what I mean? So there's that. However, in true nasty twat fashion, Holly rejects this idea, and she kind of seems to resent the doctor's attempts to psychoanalyze her, even though that's legit what she's paying him for. But while she's in the doctor's office, a new entry appears in the diary, and this makes it clear that her boyfriend is going to die, and that however it is that he's going to die, Holly feels partially responsible for it. So Holly kind of flips out. She rushes to her boyfriend's office, like he works at some, executive office or something. Goes there, but he's not there. And his secretary says, oh, he left for the airport about an hour ago. He was flying out to San Francisco to check on some of your investments. Unsurprisingly, the boyfriend is killed in a car wreck on the way to the airport. And subsequently, a new entry in the diary pops up, and it says something to the effect of, not being able to live with myself or something like that. And after that, the pages of the diary remain rather stubbornly blank. And this leads Holly to assume that means that she's going to end up taking her own life. Before that can happen, though, she tells Dr. Mill, she has a brainwave. She says, lock me in a sanitarium and keep, in a padded cell or whatever, and keep anything that might be a weapon, like, away from me so that the diary's prediction can't come true. Now, she does acknowledge that, it's entirely possible, even though she's young and in good health, that she could die of, natural causes. She could have, like, a stroke or something like that, because it does happen to younger people. So she does acknowledge that, but she's just like, I'm just trying to cover the bases I can cover, right? Now, one night, she's kind of yelling for Dr. Mill to come, and when he approaches her cell, her padded room, or whatever, she says she's finally figured out, she's like, I can't believe it took me this long to figure it out. It's so obvious. I figured out how to break the diary's curse, and I need a pen. She says, but the nurse won't give me one. Now, the nurse, I should point out, is played by none other than Lindsay Wagner of Bionic Woman fame, who I recognized immediately. She's only in it for like a second. But yeah, I was just like, hey, that's Lindsay Wagner. Yeah. So all Holly has to do, she very excitedly and kind of crazily tells Dr. Mill, is write something on, or anything, like on that blank page, and that will negate the whole prophesied suicide thing because I'll be writing something there, so obviously I'm not dead, right? And she's like, I don't know why it took me so long to figure it out, but I finally figured it out. So Dr. Mill makes this big show of like not wanting to give her the pen. It's like, well, you know why we can't give you the pens, you know what I mean? Because you could hurt yourself with it. But he finally is just like, okay, fine, I'll give you the pen. Now, as he's getting the pen from the nurse's station, the nurse is like, you're going to give it to her? And Dr. Mill says, are you new here? And then the nurse says, yeah, like this is my first shift. And then comes the kicker. Dr. Mill says, we've been giving Holly a pen every night to write in her diary for 5 years because that's how long she's been here. She's been every day. Thinks that the diary is not going to, so she has to write it every day. So she's been doing that for 5 years. So like that surprised me, okay? I didn't see that coming. So as I said, the dialogue in this one is a little bit unrealistic and kind of overly theatrical, as a lot of his screenplays tended to be. The story did lag a little bit in places, but I mean, I have to admit, largely I kind of dug this one. It was kind of cool to see Patty Duke playing like such a shitty person. And then also kind of getting her comeuppance in the end. And even though like Virginia Mayo, who played the older actress, Carrie Crane, she wasn't in the story much, but she was also really great. She was like really sympathetic as, you know, just this kind of aging actress being hounded by her younger rival. So, and yeah, like I said, the twist was excellent, really unexpected. And because of how old a lot of these stories were, and, you know, some of them are based on stories that are like even older than that, like it's really hard to like pull out a twist that surprises people because, you know, they've all been done like before and subsequently. But this twist actually I didn't expect that she had been in there for 5 years, so I thought that was pretty cool. So, you know, it's kind of hard to like have a twist that surprised me, but this one did, so kudos. So the next thing is called A Matter of Semantics, and I'm just kind of like, ugh, because this is another one of those stupid, useless, pointless comic relief vignettes that they put in here for some fucking reason. I don't know why these are in here. Like I said, they're usually like only a minute or two long, and it's just usually like a stupid joke, and it's just, I don't see what the point of it was. Like I said, if they needed to fill another minute or two of time, why didn't they just like add another minute, like another scene onto one of the longer stories instead of bothering with these? I don't know. So this one, A Matter of Semantics, you know, don't get me wrong, Cesar Romero is in this, he's delightful. But I'm like, come on. Like, the idea of Count Dracula showing up at a blood bank thinking he can make a withdrawal rather than a deposit, that was an old joke decades before this was made. So I was just like, I did not see the point of this whatsoever, and it just made me roll my eyes, like a lot of these kind of comic relief kind of things do. So the next segment is called Big Surprise. This one is also sorta kinda on kind of the gotcha one joke kind of side. But this one is at least more successful and more entertaining because it kind of builds up a nice feeling of suspense. It's a little bit longer and you're not entirely sure where it's going to go. So this is actually based on a short story by the great Richard Matheson and directed by Gino Swark. I don't know how to pronounce that dude's name. But yes, I'm just going to say the Jaws 2 guy. Directed by the Jaws 2 guy. So this segment stars the ever elderly John Carradine playing a creepy old man, which, duh. Just smart casting. So his name is Mr. Hawkins. Now, one day, 3 boys are walking home from school past his house. And Mr. Hawkins calls out to them, wanting to speak to one of the boys. His name is Chris, in particular. And that boy is played by Vincent Van Patten, one of the gigantic Van Patten family. Now, before you can say stranger danger, Chris approaches Mr. Hawkins, and Mr. Hawkins says, in the woods nearby, like you guys play in the woods, there's a big, distinctive oak tree. Do you know that oak tree? Yeah, the kid knows it. He says, if you go to that oak tree and walk out 10 paces, I don't know if we're talking about adult paces or kid paces. I don't think he said which direction to walk in. I mean, the tree is 360 degrees. I'm not really sure, but whatever. So it's like, so you walk out 10 paces, you dig down four feet, you'll get a big surprise. And picture John Carradine saying this. Now, as I said, it's John Carradine we're talking about here. So the very skin-crawling way that he conveys this information, any intelligent kid would just be hightailing it back home to call the fucking authorities. But this kid, Chris, he thinks, oh, well, maybe the guy, he's a dummy kind of, this kid. He's like, maybe he hid a bunch of treasure down there or something. So his 2 friends are a bit wiser, and they're a lot more skeptical than that. But he finally talks them into going to borrow some shovels and going along to the oak tree to find out what's buried there. Now, because this is a horror story, you know that whatever it is that's down there is not going to be good. But I admit I wasn't sure what the kid was going to find down there, so I was kind of curious. Now, the question is kind of drawn out quite a bit because the three boys just dig and dig and dig for a while, like in the middle of this. They dig to a depth that seems like 4 feet, but they don't initially find anything, which causes the two boys that aren't Chris to theorize that Mr. Hawkins was probably just fucking with them and there's nothing down there, so they just piss off home. Now, Chris, though, is bound to determine to stay there and find whatever it is he can find. So he keeps digging, and then he's yelling after his loser friends that they're forfeiting their share of the treasure that he's absolutely 100% sure is at the bottom of this hole that he's digging. And then, at long last, his shovel hits a big wooden box that could be either a treasure chest or a coffin. Care to guess which one it is? I bet you can guess which one it is. So the lid of the box starts going up by itself, and Chris obviously like flips out, as you would. Now, I wondered for a second if this is going to be another vampire story, but no. Turns out that John Carradine is in the box. And he sits up and he grins that creepy-ass grin, and he's like, surprise to the kid. And I was just like, ugh. It was like, that kind of freaked me out a little bit. And I was just kind of like, it seems like obvious in hindsight, and I'm just like, when I didn't know that that's what was going to happen, I was just like, oh, duh, I should have guessed, but I didn't. So I was just like, oh, well played, segment, well played, you got me. And then I was like, shit, man, I'm going to have to figure out how to do that trick on somebody one of these days. Although, I guess I'd have to look as terrifying as John Carradine for it to really work effectively, so I might have to wait like 30 or 40 years until I look like a withered old crone, and then I could like fuck with that. Would be like super cool. I want to do that. But yeah, just like the way that they film him is just like super creepy, because when he did pop out, I was like, surprise. I was just kind of like, wow. It was so nasty. But yeah, this was like a pretty fun one. So the last segment of episode 8 is called Professor Peabody's Last Lecture, and this is a very overt, very on the nose Lovecraft homage, I guess I would call it, because it's not based on a Lovecraft story, but you'll see what I mean. So it was written by Jack Laird and directed by Gerald Friedman. So Carl Reiner is in this, the very famous Carl Reiner, and he plays the titular Professor Peabody, who is some kind of teacher of, I guess, like ancient superstitions or cult beliefs or something like that. But he's very skeptical and a little bit condescending about the shit, like basically saying every single myth dreamed up by mankind is just this big load of hogwash that, they used up and wasted all this time that could have been spent on, making practical progress, like figuring out how to go grow crops and shit like that, instead of coming up with all these fantastical stories. So he's kind of one of those kind of dudes. Now, the story takes place entirely in one classroom, very budget conscious, and is almost a one-man show, because really Carl Reiner is the one, acting through those. There's a whole classroom full of people, but they don't really do much. So the professor is just kind of, he goes through this litany of all the superstitions they've discussed in the class so far, but astute viewers will notice the names of several of Lovecraft's great old ones written on the chalkboard. You know what I mean? Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, all that kind of stuff. Now, Peabody tells the class that he's going to show them, all this superstitious nonsense isn't a thing of the past, because the worship of these great old ones that we're going to be talking about now started only about 50 years ago in Arkham, Massachusetts. Yes, you guessed it. So then he goes down the list on the chalkboard of all the gods, talking about each one. And as he's talking, a really weird storm starts brewing up outside the classroom windows, because they're great old ones and you're not supposed to be talking about them, letting blah, blah, blah. So a student whose last name is Derleth, I was like, yeah, nice touch, stands up and asks a question. And if that wasn't obvious enough for you, then another student stands up to kind of make a comment, and Peabody calls him Mr. Lovecraft. Now, this particular student is just this really over-the-top, like, stuttering dork. I mean, so much so, it's not even, he stutters too, but it's just kind of like, he's like he's going like that, and I'm just like, holy crap, what the fuck is that all about? So it's just the fact that they made him named Mr. Lovecraft. I'm like, H.P. Lovecraft was a weird dude, sure, but he wasn't like the over-the-top nerd stereotype. It's like not even that. It's just like way several measures beyond that. But it's just, so I thought that was kind of weird that they did that, like they made him into like a joke kind of. So, didn't love that. So the professor keeps talking, and he reveals that he has, a very rare copy of the Necronomicon, of course, and he starts reading from it with just ever-heightening intensity as the storm starts getting worse and worse outside. And then, at the very end, in a sort of lame punchline, let's call it that, the professor turns into another kind of seaweedy-looking creature with one eye bulging out of the seaweed. You know what I mean? A lot of seaweed monsters turning up in this. This is the second one. There was one in Brenda, too. And then, so he's a seaweed monster with one eye going, bugging out. And then he just very calmly asks the class if there are any more questions. And the students look at him with, let's call it mild consternation. They don't really look horrified or shocked. They're just kind of like, huh. You know what I mean? Most of them. Except a couple of them are just it's way over the top. It's just really funny because most of the people are just like, isn't that weird? But then some of them are just it's pretty funny. When they go across all the faces. So yeah. So this segment just seemed kind of there. Seemed like it was just basically made as a weak gag, aimed at Lovecraft fans. You know what I mean? There wasn't really any particular tension or suspense. You knew exactly what was going to happen. I mean, I didn't know exactly what was going to happen because I admit I didn't foresee the professor turning into, a heap of boiled kale with eyes. But, I mean, the whole thing just felt very forced. So, not terrible, but, not really all that good either. I still love Carl Reiner, but yeah, this one was kind of lame. So, episode 9. The first segment of this is called House with Ghost. This one was actually pretty good. I actually quite liked this one. This was written and directed by Gene Kearney. And this has to do with a man whose name is Ellis, who's actually played by Bob Crane of Hogan's Heroes and who got horribly murdered. And his wife, Iris, played by Joanne Worley, which I thought was pretty funny. So they're spending some time in London. Now, at the beginning, Ellis is bitching that they kind of got the shit end of the deal. I guess they did a real estate swap, with another couple called the Twitchells. This doesn't really amount to anything, but they're just this is how it starts. Apparently, the Twitchells got to stay in Ellis and Iris's big fancy house in the U.S., and then while they're stuck in London in the Twitchells' dinky 3-room apartment that isn't even big enough to have a good party in, for crying out loud. So he's kind of complaining about that. Now, Iris seems less concerned about the situation. She's had a couple of seances in the flat. They established that she's kind of into spiritualism and stuff. But Ellis finally convinced her, look, this place is too fucking small. We need to rent a bigger place. So he comes across an ad in the paper, which is offering houses for rent outside the city, and you can have them with ghost or without, which is kind of neat. So Iris loves the idea of living in a haunted house, if only for a month. I'm presuming they're on vacation or something like that. So Ellis goes to this kind of dusty old real estate office. This was kind of probably my favorite scene. I don't know why. I just really liked this scene a lot. And he's going through all the books of properties. And then there's the old man who runs the place named Mr. Chichester. And he gives him information about what kinds of ghosts are available in all the houses, which I thought was neat that they had all the distinctions. I'm like, oh my God, that'd be so cool if that was true. So he's he gives him all of these tips, you know what I mean? So he's like, well, it's better, if you're going to have a house with a ghost, it's better to have one closer to the city because the ghosts only tend to make noise during reasonable hours, business hours. But if you go out in the country, country ghosts, they'll wake up very early and start making a racket, and you might not want that. So I just thought, I was like, well, that's good to know. So Ellis really wants a country house, though, because his wife, Iris, supposedly has health problems, dizzy spells and stuff, and is supposedly will do better out in the country, right? So Ellis finally picks a house out in the Cotswolds, and he's particularly taken with the home's grand staircase, for reasons which will become clear later on. Now, the ghost in residence at this house is a relatively new ghost, as in he hasn't been dead that long, and his name is Mr. Canby. Now, the reason that the house is up for rent is because Mrs. Canby was living in the house, but she had enough trouble getting along with Mr. Canby while he was still alive, and now that he's ghost form, he's just, insufferable. She's like, fuck this noise, I'm renting this out to somebody else, which who can blame her, really? So once Ellis and Iris move into the house, there are a few kind of ghostly happenings, little paranormal kind of shit floating around and everything like that. And it's also revealed that Ellis has been seeing a hot British blonde named Sherry on the side. So he's been, 2-time in on his wife, right? Now, he has promised Sherry that he's in the process of divorcing his wife. However, he's actually planning on having Iris accidentally fall down that fabulous marble staircase. So he actually convinces Iris to go see a local doctor so that her dizzy spells and her health problems will be on record. So then when she falls down the stairs, it'll look like an accident, right? He's a criminal mastermind is what I'm saying. But the doctor examines her and actually tells Ellis, you know, your wife's illness is a lot more serious than we thought. And it's like, and she probably won't live that much longer, like maybe only a couple more months. So Ellis is basically like, awesome. Oh, I mean, what a bummer. You know what I mean? Yeah, he's like totally overjoyed because he figures, hey, maybe now I don't have to go through all the trouble of murdering my wife after all. That's awesome. So he calls up his mistress to tell her the good news. Unfortunately for him, though, Hot Blonde Sherry, who it's implied had a lot of men on the go, not just him, though he obviously didn't know this because he's a chump. She's kind of gotten sick of waiting for him to make good on his promises. I guess he has a lot of money is maybe what they don't really establish that with to any great degree, but that's what I assumed. So she's like, hey, you know, you weren't quick enough. Too bad, so sad. I'm moving away with one of my other sugar daddies, so leave me alone. So Ellis is kind of crestfallen by this situation. And as he hangs up the phone, Iris kind of appears at the top of the staircase and is like, hey, what you doing down there? Like, what are you up to? And at this point, a ghostly hand, at one point earlier, like the ghost had kind of dragged her out of bed. So you know that the ghost can like move shit around. So this ghostly hand comes down and like pushes her and she just tumbles to the bottom of the staircase and presumably dies instantly. Now, only seconds later, Mr. Canby's ghost appears and he has sort of like a invoice for Ellis, which I thought was very funny. I'm like, wow, even after death, they have paperwork. So Canby, being dead and, you know, privy to such information, knew that Ellis was planning on killing Iris. And he's like, yeah, so I just thought I'd help you out. So he's kind of like charging him, you know what I mean? Then the ghost basically threatens to kill Ellis too, which I guess is another thing because the ghost was like, look, I can just push you down the stairs anytime I feel like it and you won't even see me coming, you know? So that's kind of scary. So he's like, I'm going to kill you too, unless you agree to rent this house in perpetuity, like forever. You have to pay the rent of £2,000 a month, which, holy shit, £2,000 a month back in 1971? That is a huge amount of money. Like, I know it's London, but, or, no, it's not even London. It was like out in the Cotswolds. Holy crap. That's like a lot of money. So he's basically like, you have to pay that. You don't pay it to my wife anymore, because fuck her. Pay it to my mistress, who I promised to take care of, like, before I died. So you have to stay here forever and pay £2,000 a month to my mistress, or I'm going to push your ass down the stairs too. That was the deal. So yeah, so this was a pretty good segment, like I said. Bob Crane and Joanne Worley were really good in it. And as I said, the scene in the real estate office with all the different kinds of ghosts, like some of the romper room ghosts and the, you want a staircase ghost, you want this kind of ghost. It's like, I really liked that scene. I don't know why. It just like abused the shit out of me. I'm going to say like a lot of these stories, this is kind of true of the entire series, but they seem to be aiming more toward funny than scary. But in this instance, it didn't really bother me all that much. It wasn't wacky. I mean, it was kind of funny, but it was more like a dry humor, I guess, which I can vibe with that more. But yeah, so like the acting and the story like kept me entertained in this one, so I didn't really mind that it was kind of more on the funny side than the scary side. Okay, so the next thing is another one of those silly little vignettes, and this one is called A Midnight Visit to the Neighborhood Blood Bank. And I'm sitting there going, damn, like yet another vampire to blood bank story? Do we really need another one of those? But not exactly. So this one actually has Victor Buono in it, who was in some of the other segments earlier that I talked about. And he's like the stereotypically like blue-skinned, cape-wearing vampire. And he comes into the window of a young woman who's sleeping one night. And he bends down to her neck like gonna drink her blood. She very calmly says to him, I gave it the office. And then he apologizes to her and marks like another name off of his list, like off the book. I was just like, oh, man, I was like, these creaky old jokes are really starting to get to me. And then afterward, I was like, wow, I'm surprised the vampire didn't say anything about window viping. You know what I mean? Do you guys remember that old? Yeah, that was like old when I was a kid, and I'm old. So yeah, I just, like I said, I don't really see the point of these, and this one was also kind of dumb. Also, I never understood. I gave it the office was just like such. I didn't really understand that even when I was a kid, because that was even kind of like a thing that came off like it was a punchline of a joke. And I'm like, I get what it means, but it's just like, why is that funny? I don't really know. But yeah, so this one utilized that, and I'm just like, nah, we didn't need this, but whatever, there it is. Now the next story is much better. It's a serious, atmospheric story that isn't trying to be funny, thank God. So this one's called Dr. Stringfellow's Rejuvenator. Now this one was written by Rod Serling and directed by Gerald Friedman. And this story, we're following a snake oil salesman named Dr. Ernest Stringfellow. And there's him, and he has this supposedly simple-minded assistant named Rolfo. And they've parked their little medicine wagon in, this takes place like in the Old West, you know what I mean? So it's in this little Old West town, and he's in the process, obviously, of like fleecing the locals out of their hard-earned cash with this miraculous medicine that he has, which supposedly cures every goddamn disease ever known to man, and maybe even some we haven't thought of yet. Now, after his spiel, he's inside the wagon, and the doctor sees a man outside, like, asking Rolfo, the assistant, some questions, like, with this really intense expression on his face. And the doctor starts getting, like, pretty nervous. He's like, holy shit, we're about to get run out of town on a rail, right? Because I'm sure that's happened before. But then, like, the man comes to the wagon's door, and he asks the doctor to just come have a look at his daughter, who's deathly ill. So this poor man has already lost his wife and his other child, and there aren't any doctors in town, so he's getting pretty desperate, like, you're my last hope kind of thing. So the doctor is basically, like, real reluctant. He's like, nah, man, I don't do that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? I'm not qualified. He doesn't say that, but he just comes up with some excuse why he doesn't want to do it. However, he changes his tune when the man, like, offers his meager life savings. And so Stringfellow then, he's like, okay, I'll go outside and have a look at her. So she's kind of laying out on the street, because I guess the dude, like, brought her into town, like, on the wagon or whatever. So the kid, I mean, she looks like she's in terrible pain, and she looks real gray. And the doctor just does not seem phased at all, and he's just chipper as you please, and he just sells the dad a bottle of his amazing, miraculous rejuvenator that'll have her fixed up in no time. So the dad takes the daughter back home. And then we meet another doctor named Dr. Snyder, who's actually played by Murray Hamilton, who you will probably recognize as the sleazy mayor of Amity from Jaws, so there's that. So Dr. Snyder actually used to practice medicine in this town, but he lost his medical license because he's a drunk. So there's that. And he's drunk pretty much through this whole episode. But he's not wrong. You know what I mean? So Snyder tells Stringfellow, look, the girl clearly has peritonitis and she will be dead within a week. You know that. I know that. And he basically gets all over Stringfellow's case for taking the father's money and giving him false hope that she's going to survive or she's going to get better. Now, Stringfellow seems to feel kind of bad, a little bit bad, maybe not. And he actually justifies his line of work by saying, well, I'm not really selling the actual medicine because all that is like caramel coloring and some wood alcohol. I am, in fact, selling faith, which, okay, that helps you sleep at night. So he's drinking with his assistant, Rolfo, in the local saloon or whatever, and he gets a little bit, you know, as he gets drunker, he gets like a little bit full of himself, right? And he says, yeah, I'm selling faith, and with enough faith, I could bring that girl back from the dead. And I'm just like, bet you can't. You know what I mean? Yeah, so that. Now, at first, I thought that was the way the story was going to go. That it would turn out that his fake rejuvenator actually did have, like, resurrection powers that he didn't know about. And I was like, well, that would kind of be a happy ending, though, which is literally not conducive to a horror story. But I'm going to say, nope, this one actually takes a lot more of a somber turn. And I actually really appreciated that because I was like, I didn't really want that. That's the way I thought it was going to go, and I'm glad it didn't go that way. So the father of the little girl comes to the bar and confronts Stringfellow and says, basically, the daughter's pain is getting worse. You said that, you know, this was going to fix her up. You know, she's pretty much at death's door. Like, you know, she's outside. Now, Stringfellow starts bloviating. I'm going to fix everything. I can bring her back from the brink. I can do this shit. I've got faith. I'm amazing, blah, blah, blah. But in the very next scene, we discover that the girl has indeed died, just as Dr. Snyder said that she would. Stringfellow is basically like, well, can't win them all. You know what I mean? And then he just makes plans like, hey, in the morning we gotta fucking skedaddle to the next town full of suckers, but, you know, before we get lynched or whatever. But as he goes outside the saloon, he sees the girl, clearly alive, like sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of the funeral home, like across the street from the saloon. So it's kind of dark, like it's dusk, and so we can't really see her properly. But he gets closer asking, oh, did you really come back from the dead? Or are you just like a ghost set to torment me or whatever? So I guess he does kind of feel guilty a little bit deep down. Now, once he gets close enough, though, the girl disappears. And the funeral home sign, which was kind of blowing around all crazy because it's real windy, it breaks off and seems to come crashing down on his head. That's kind of what you're implying. That's what it implies. In the next scene, though, the Undertaker tells Rolfo that the sign missed Stringfellow by quite a bit, but he died anyway because his heart gave out. Like I guess he thought the ghost was taking revenge on him. He was like, oh, and like he couldn't take it. You know what I mean? Now Rolfo, so they have Stringfellow laid out a coffin or whatever, and Rolfo just looks very dispassionately down at his former boss, and he's like, wow, Stringfellow always thought he was the smart one, but actually he was the dumbest one of everybody, which fair. And then Rolfo tosses a lantern into the medicine wagon, like, to set it on fire. And Snyder was like, why'd you do that? And Rolfo says, why not? Nothing in there worth anything. And then the fire spreads to the funeral home that has Stringfellow's body in it. And then Rolfo says, nothing in there worth anything either. And I was like, yikes. Rolfo was one cold motherfucker. I was like, he is right, though. I mean, to be honest. So I didn't mind too much, but I was just kind of like, yeah, well, okay. That's fair enough, Rolfo. But yeah, so this was actually a really good segment. It was kind of spooky. It was very downbeat, which I liked. It wasn't trying to be funny. It had really excellent acting in it. It had a really good atmosphere, like this creepy Old West kind of atmosphere. This was definitely one of the best stories that I've seen in this batch of episodes, like by quite a significant margin. So this next one is called Hell's Bells. And this is another kind of goofy installment. It's somewhat redeemed by the presence of John Astin, obviously the Gomez Addams from the original Addams Family show. So this one was written and directed by Theodore J. Flicker, based on a short story by Harry Turner. So John Astin plays a hippie. I don't think they ever say what his name is, so he's just an unnamed hippie. And he's wearing quite an outfit, I will say. He has like black velvet pants on, for one thing. His boots were the thing that struck me because they're these super groovy knee-high boots that are like patchwork. They're fucking crazy. So this hippie accidentally drives his car off the road at night. The car explodes spectacularly, as the law said that all cars in movies and TV shows had to do in the 1970s when they drove off a cliff. And the hippie then goes into another dimension briefly in a very, very cheesy, whoa, kind of thing. And then he slides into, there's this kind of laundry chute type situation, and he goes into this kind of generic looking waiting room. So there's nobody else around, but when he drops like a part of a cigarette wrapper or something like that on the floor, this kind of chubby housekeeper woman just pops into existence to pick it up and like nags at him for littering. So the hippie asks the woman, who actually introduces herself as Fat Lady, so for some reason. So he asks if this is hell, and she says this is just the waiting room. Now, after they have a little bit of back and forth, and she's complaining about how many people are coming into hell and what do they expect us to do. I guess her hell is she has to like clean up after everybody that comes to hell, which would suck a lot. But yeah, so she's just like, I don't know what they expect us to do. We're so understaffed, blah blah blah, and like all these people are coming to hell, yada yada. So I don't know. That was some kind of like social commentary they were making, but whatever. So then she like vanishes again. So the hippie's kind of hanging around for a bit. But then there's like a red sign above this other door that starts flashing next, and then the door starts to open by itself. So the hippie wonders, ooh, I wonder what hell's going to be like. And he kind of seems pretty chill about it, or kind of excited about it. You know what I mean? He's kind of imagining like all these, hell kind of, you know what I mean? Like Dante's Inferno and stuff like that. And he's like, man, that's going to be so cool. Like, I can't, that's going to be so groovy. Yeah, so he's imagining like whips and chains and snakes and all the cool shit. You know what I mean? Like the front of a black metal album. He's just like, yeah, it's going to be awesome. But then when he gets through the door, he's in this kind of dowdy looking parlor, I guess. It has kind of tacky wallpaper and sort of Victorian furniture, which is actually kind of nice. I don't really mind it. But yeah. Now, so he figures this is another waiting room. And then across the room, he sees this huge, like enormous stack of albums and a record player, like kind of on the sideboard. And he's like all excited, and he starts sorting through them, like hoping he finds, ooh, I wonder if they have any by my groups, he says. Like the Beatles or something. I think the Beatles is the only band that he mentions. But yeah, so he's just trying to find some Beatles records in there. Just then, however, the record player starts playing some kind of like Lawrence Welk sounding shit, like on its own. And the hippie can't turn it off. After he tries for a little bit, he's like, what the fuck? So he deliberately drops a piece of garbage on the ground, like to get the fat lady to appear again. And it's like, hey, lady, can you turn the music off? And she's like, nah, tough titty, pretty much. So then an old farmer man appears in one of the chairs, and the hippie is kind of like really happy to see him at first, since he's like, oh boy, now I have somebody to talk to. But the old fart just kind of drones on and on about boring bullshit, and it's just kind of like he doesn't understand anything that the hippie is talking about. And then, to make matters worse, this middle-aged touristy couple shows up with like 8,000 slides of their trip to Mexico that they want to show him. So the hippie, obviously, is writing a major bummer about this man, and he demands for the devil to show himself. So a dude in kind of your classic cheesy devil Halloween costume, obligingly pops into the frame. And the hippie asks, well, when am I going to get to go to hell where all the cool, Boschian shit is? But as you probably have guessed, it turns out that this room with these boring ass people and this terrible music is the hippie's hell, and he has to be here forever. The devil says hell is very personalized, and the devil tells the hippie, quite calmly, that this very room that he will spend eternity in is someone else's idea of heaven. I don't know if he means that this is the farmer, like the boring farmer that was in there, or the obnoxious touristy people. Like, is this their idea of heaven? And the hippie just gets, does their idea of heaven have a hippie in it that doesn't really want to be there? I don't know. I'm just wondering. But yeah, so he's just like, think about that as you're here for eternity. That some people, this is their idea of heaven, but it's your idea of hell. You know what I mean? So I was like, ooh, devil's food for thought. And then I was like, oh, sorry, that was terrible. So, yeah. Okay, now I will watch anything with John Astin in it because I love him. Now, in this segment, though, I felt kind of bad for him because they put him in this ridiculous, hippie getup and made him use, every cliched hippie phrase in the book. And you can tell that, an old person wrote this. You know what I mean? And really, anybody with two brain cells to rub together can see the joke coming from a mile away. So, I mean, this was cute, but it was kind of a letdown after the previous segment, which was a lot more serious. You know what I mean? So, episode 10. The first segment of this one is called The Dark Boy. And again, thank God, this is another kind of creepy, more solemn type of story. And this one was directed by John Astin, who we were just talking about, and based on a story by August Derleth. Now, this one, it doesn't really have any surprises or twists or anything like that. It's essentially just a straightforward ghost story. But I kind of appreciated the eerie tone of it and, the thankful lack of goofiness. So Elizabeth Hartman plays Judith Tim, who is a woman who shows up in this small town back in Little House on the Prairie days to be the new school teacher. So she rooms in a house with these two kind of meddling old biddies who, I mean, they seem nice enough, but are clearly a little weird and they're hiding stuff from her, quite obviously. So when Judith meets all her students, she notices that there are 17 of them. There are 16 blonde kids and one dark-haired boy with a scar on his forehead. No, not Harry Potter. So the two biddies say, this is impossible. There are actually only 16 students. We're friends with everybody on the school board. We should know. So Judith shrugs this off. She's like, oh, well, I must have miscounted. No big deal. She also tells the biddies that she's staying with, well, I'm going to be doing some work in the schoolhouse at night so I can get caught up. I want to get everything organized. But the biddies do not like that idea one bit. They don't think that she should be there at night. But she does it anyway. So while Judith is there working one night, she sees the face of the dark-haired student, the little boy, kind of peeking in through the window. Now, she tries to get him to come inside, but he runs off. Now, whenever she asks the biddies about him, they kind of clam up and then sort of change the subject. But Judith figures out that the boy is probably related to a local farmer named Tom Robb because they look similar. I guess everybody else in town is blonde, fucking Village of the Damned or something, and these are the only dark-haired people. So yeah, so she figures, well, they must be related. Now Tom, the dad, he actually brings his other kid to school kind of grudgingly. I guess he's like, well, he's not going to be here all the time because I need him on the farm and blah, blah, blah. And he very particularly gives Judith this weird tip. He's just I want you to keep this kid away from ladders. You know what I mean? And she's just okay, that's a little random, but all right. So Judith does some digging kind of back through the school records, and she discovers that this mysterious boy she's been seeing is indeed Joel Robb, and that he repeated 4th grade twice. So, not so great a student, or he was a little bit behind or whatever. So the next time she's working at night and she sees the kid looking in the window at her, she goes outside to talk to him. And she basically says that she knows who he is, and it's like, do you want me to come here at night and teach you? Because, you were behind. Now, he doesn't talk, but he nods like he wants to do that, and then he runs off again. Now, it wasn't real clear to me at this point whether Judith knows that Joel is a ghost, because of course he is. But I guess maybe not at this stage, because she goes to the Robb house and asks Tom about his other son, and he just about loses his shit on her. And it's like, why are you tormenting me? Like, why can't everybody just leave me alone? So he has like a little bit of like a mini nervous breakdown or whatever. And then she finally gets him to tell her that Joel was indeed his son, which but that he died 2 years ago after he fell off a ladder at the school and he busted his head open. Hence the scar. Tom then tells her, it's like, yeah, I see him too, but the kid won't approach me. And Judith says, I think it's because you're afraid of him, and he can sense that. I'm not afraid of him. Like, I guess at this stage, yes, she knows he's a ghost. But she's like, I'm not afraid of him, and that's why he came to me instead of to you. So Judith later asked the biddies, like, why didn't you tell me that the schoolhouse was haunted? And they tell her, well, we weren't actually sure if it was. Like, the previous teacher did complain about seeing Joel, but they didn't believe her, and they actually fired her because they thought she was crazy. So, like, in hindsight, we feel kind of bad about that, which, yeah. So it turns out that this previous teacher had also sent this letter to Judith, basically telling her not to take the teaching job, but not saying why. And it was anonymous, you know what I mean? So Judith was like, who the hell would send me this? You know what I mean? But that's probably who it was. So Judith starts teaching the ghostly kid in the schoolhouse at night. And one night, Tom, the ghost dad, comes there and kind of puts his fear aside and holds his hand out to the kid. Now, in the interim, like, Judith and Tom have kind of started up a bit of a romance. So they basically tell the boy, come home with them, like, be a part of the family or whatever. So Joel, the ghost, actually follows them toward the house for a while, but then when they get back to the house, the boy is gone. And then they just kind of show that he went back to his little grave, like where he was buried. So you're led to assume that he's settled whatever matter was keeping him earthbound, presumably wanting to contact his dad. And he has, thus gone into the light, I guess, if you want to say it like that. So, like I said, this was a pretty decent segment. It didn't have any twists. I actually was expecting some at some points, but they didn't really happen. It just kind of went on the way you would think it would go on. And it's kind of more sad than scary, but I liked that it was kind of melancholy and kind of like low key without any attempts at humor or anything. And the acting was actually pretty great too. So the next segment is called Keep in Touch, We'll Think of Something. Now this one was a little bit odd. I kind of liked it, I think. I'm not really sure. So this was written and directed by Gene Kearney, as a lot of these were. And the story starts with a pianist named Eric Sutton. And he's reporting to the police that his car was stolen by a female hitchhiker that he picked up, like, while driving around late at night. So the main cop in charge, named Sergeant Bryce, who's actually played by an actor named Richard O'Brien, but it's not the Richard O'Brien from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So the cop is just like totally gruff and suspicious, and he really does not seem to care one iota about the crime, like, at all. It's like he's almost like he resents anybody coming in that's like, what do you want me to do? Solve crimes? You know what I mean? It's kind of that type of thing. I got that impression. I mean, he states outright that he's not even going to look for the woman that stole the car. And this makes Sutton get, understandably a little bit outraged. It's like, if this is literally your job, though? Like, why? Yeah. So the cop is kind of like, well, it would be different if she maybe used the car in a bank heist, or if she pistol whipped you or something like that. But since she didn't, we're just going to look for the car. But, whatever. So apparently, boosting a car is, perfectly cromulent in this town, provided you don't utilize violence. I mean, that's good to know. So they eventually find Sutton's car, like, parked in a parking lot somewhere, and everything seems to be fine. It's not fucked up. Nothing was stolen or anything. But a short time later, Sutton returns to the police station and tells them that the same woman stole his car a second time. And this time, she bashed him over the head with a gun butt before she did it, like she knocked him out. Now, Sutton tells the cops, that he presumes she got his address from the registration and is now maybe stalking him for some reason. So Sergeant Bryce wonders if this mystery woman had anything to do with why Sutton separated from his wife, which I guess happened fairly recently, but he insists that the two things are not related. So since the woman allegedly assaulted Sutton in the course of the theft this time around, the cops finally decide to haul themselves off their fat asses and put out an APB on her. And then they bring in a sketch artist so Sutton can give a description. And the drawing comes out so nice that Bryce tells the artist that belongs in the Louvre. And that's exactly how he says it, which I admit cracked me up a lot. He also pretty crassly says, ooh, now I understood why you picked her up, like, in the first place, because woo, hubba hubba, you know what I mean? Because she's, like, kind of hot. So then we see the woman in actuality, and she's played by Joanna Patet, I think is how you pronounce her last name, who I actually immediately recognized from The Evil, the 1978 haunted house movie, which, if you haven't seen it, it's really good, so I think it's really underrated. So she was in that, and I recognized her. So she's coming out of a department store and kind of being asked by a cop, like, to come down to the station, because the cop recognized her from the drawing. Now, Sutton comes in and looks at 5 women in a lineup, one of which is her. Now, her name turns out to be Claire Foster, so that's what I'm going to call her. So when Claire steps forward, Sutton very clearly recognizes her, like, oh, that's her, you know what I mean? But then he very oddly tells the cops, the woman who stole my car isn't here. And then he basically, like, hotfoots it out of the room, right? So Claire, who seems just as confused as the cops, she's like, yeah, you know, neither me or my husband want to press charges because, you know, he'd been putting her through all this shit, you know, trying to accuse her of a crime. And she's married too. So now she actually kind of wants to go talk to him and see if all of this nonsense can be sorted out. So she runs out the place and manages to catch up with him. So she meets up with him in this bar, and they drink some martinis, and Sutton starts telling her the whole very convoluted story. And brace yourselves, because this is pretty crazy. So first of all, Sutton's car was never actually stolen. That was just a story that he told the cops twice, which seems like a really drastic waste of police resources, gonna say, and taxpayer dollars, Sutton. And they would absolutely charge you for making false reports, which they do kind of mention in this, but it never does happen. So basically, Sutton has been having dreams about a woman who he's sure is Claire. He's like, I know it's you. And the intense way that he talks about it makes it very obvious that he thinks that this dream woman is trying to, like, psychically contact him so they can be together because they're like soulmates or twin flames, if you want to go back to that fucking cult show that we did a little while back. So he started believing, you know, and this is talking about a little bit in the past. He started believing that this dream woman might actually exist in reality somewhere. So at first, he tried to hire a private detective to, like, track her down. But the detective was just like, what the fuck, bro? And said, I'm going to charge you, like, I'll do it, but I'm going to charge you an arm and a leg because this is a wild goose chase. This is a woman from a dream. She doesn't exist, you dumbass. I'll take your money. But he's like, well, yeah, I don't have that much money. So Sutton then hits on the bizarre idea to make up a story about the stolen car and the pistol whipping so that he could get the police to find her for free. So this is a little horrifying, frankly. And I'm actually surprised Claire didn't just, like, flee in terror from the fucking bar as soon as he started explaining this cockamamie plot to her, because it really just kind of screams deranged stalker, you know what I'm saying? But no, she stays and she hears him out, which, you know, makes her either a braver or a stupider woman than I am. So she tells him she's never had any dreams about him. And she also says that she's been contentedly married for 3 years. So Sutton hops right on that word choice. And he gets in her face, contentedly or happily. You know what I mean? He's really trying to lead her down one path, is what I'm saying. Now, as their conversation goes on, though, it comes to light that Claire's husband also has very intense dreams, but they're more like nightmares. She tells Sutton he has this recurring dream that an unidentified man breaks into their house and strangles him to death. Claire said he's been to a psychiatrist about it, and the psychiatrist said, oh, well, he might have some kind of unresolved guilt about something, but what that might be, she says she doesn't know. It's kind of implied that he has fucked around on her, but it's also implied that she's fucked around on him too. So, fair play, I guess. Now, she further tells Sutton that although her husband never sees the man's face in the dream, the assailant has, like, this big long scar on the back of his hand. So then she turns over Sutton's hand to see if there's a scar there, but there's not. So Sutton kind of just keeps at her, like pressing her about her husband and about all of this stuff. And then she finally admits that she's afraid of her husband and isn't sure what he might do. She says, well, he's in Venezuela on business, like at the moment, but he'll be back in a week. So Sutton is basically like, run away with me then. I'm going on tour, like I said, as a pianist. It's like, I'm scheduled to go, I'm going to be in New Zealand and Australia. We'll be all the way around the world. Like, your husband will never find you, blah, blah, blah. So Claire says, I can't, you know. But then she does kind of seem to be leaning toward going along with it, even though she literally just met this dude, right? So then the two of them just start, like, making out, like, in this bar. And then while they're embracing, Claire, very surreptitiously, gets a pair of scissors out of her purse and makes a big slice across the back of Sutton's hand. And then he's like, what the fuck? And then she's like, yeah, you can stay at my place for a few days until the stitches come out. So I guess since Sutton is such a big believer in dreams and fate and stuff, that he's now like obligated to kill her husband. So there's that. So as I said, this one was kind of strange. The whole idea of making a false report to the police just so you can find like a hot woman that you dreamed about is kind of out there, I'm gonna say. And it's even more out there that Claire wouldn't have immediately like filed a restraining order against Sutton after he told her what he was up to. Because what the fuck? I also wasn't real sure if Claire had actually had dreams about Sutton too and just told him that she hadn't. I mean, it seems a little bit coincidental that Sutton found this random woman from his dreams who just happened to want somebody to kill her husband, who had just happened to have dreams about being strangled by an unidentified man. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know if it was supposedly implied that there was some kind of psychic connection or whatever. I mean, if you think about it too hard, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but, you know, oh well. I also don't understand the title of this story. Keep in touch, we'll think of something. Like, that doesn't have anything to do with anything. Like, I have no idea what it's referring to. But, you know, again, what are you going to do? This was a decent segment, but a bit on the inscrutable side. It wasn't as weird as that one that I talked about before that seemed like it was supposed to be a stage play, but there was no reason for it to be a stage play. It wasn't as weird as that, but it was in that ballpark. You know what I'm saying? So episode 11, the segment we start out with is Pickman's Model. So this is directed by Jack Laird, written by Alvin Sapinsley, as I think is how you pronounce his last name. Obviously, of course, this was adapted from the 1927 short story by H.P. Lovecraft, which has actually always been one of my favorite short stories of his. Now, even though this segment added a whole bunch of detail that wasn't in the original story, I think it's still a pretty solid adaptation because it's a pretty short story. So, you know, it has to be kind of fleshed out. Like, it had some really good acting performances in it, had a pretty cool monster suit, although I am going to say I would have liked if they'd showed it a little bit less. So the beginning of the segment starts out kind of like the original story does. So it's in the present day. There's two art collectors or something whose names are Larry and Elliot. And they're discussing a painting that they found in this shabby old like attic loft that one of them is renting. So this kind of spooky painting is called, I think it's called Ghoul Preparing to Die. Like, the painting in the original story, I think, was called Ghoul Feeding, if I remember correctly. But, you know, it's the same kind of thing. So this painting was very likely painted by the infamous 19th century artist Richard Upton Pickman, who is actually played by Bradford Dillman in this segment. So the artist mysteriously disappeared many years ago, along with most of his canvases. So because this particular painting was found here in this attic loft, the collectors surmise that it's entirely possible that this very room used to be Pickman's studio, because back in the day, nobody really knew where it was. So at that point, we then go into an extended flashback, and we meet Pickman himself. Now, because of the horrific nature of his work, the artist has been kicked out of the Art Institute, but he is allowed to kind of like earn a somewhat meager living teaching kind of well-bred young ladies to paint, provided that he only teaches them to paint like flowers and vases and just other kind of harmless shit like that, like not monsters. Now, at this particular class, one of his students, whose name is Mavis Goldsmith, paints the flowers in front of her, but she makes them like all wilted and dead, and she claims that that's how she sees them. And she also starts sketching in a face behind the flowers, which she says is supposed to be Pickman, like watching over them, like he has power over them, like making them wilt or whatever. Now, Pickman seems kind of intrigued by her somewhat morbid nature because it kind of mirrors his own. But he also is sort of condescending toward her, and he tells her, he's like, look, when you paint what you see, you have to watch out because you might end up looking at your own soul and like not liking that shit one bit, you know? And he seems like he's speaking from experience, which if you've read this story, you know where this is going. So then he takes her pencil or charcoal or whatever and starts sketching out his face in her drawing to look like this monstrous creature, which is the same monster from the Ghoul Preparing to Die painting, which he is coincidentally brought along to show his class on that particular day. It also comes to light that Mavis has actually bought one of Pickman's older, like, non-scary paintings, which is a simple scene from the window of his studio, and this will be important later on in the story. So as all the women are leaving the class, this kind of uptight old bat, who is, I guess she's like a representative of whoever hired Pickman to teach this class, comes in and basically tells him he's fired because some of the ladies' parents have been complaining that he's a bad influence on them because he has kind of a bad reputation because of his artwork. So he goes to a tavern to kind of drown his sorrows, and Mavis follows him. She's like totally intrigued, and she like very boldly invites herself to tea with him, despite him like really protesting that, and you know, he wants her to fuck off, but she's like, it will not go, you know what I mean? She's very pushy. But not in an obnoxious way, but I mean, yeah. So after a bunch of back and forth, Mavis finally gets Pickman to tell her that he's been working on a series of paintings that's based around this legend, with bunny rabbit ears, of these horrible half-human creatures who live in the tunnels underneath the city and will, every now and then, will come out to capture women to use for breeding purposes. So there's that. Mavis seems kind of scandalized by this, but also like, you know what I mean? You can kind of tell at her face, she's like, that's hot. Yeah, it's that kind of thing. So she asks if she can go to Pickman's studio to see the paintings, and he's like, oh, hell no. That's not, nobody sees my paintings. Nobody comes to my studio. He's a very tortured artist, you know what I mean? So she then confesses to Pickman that she is completely in love with him. And he's like, well, I feel sorry for you because I'm just too tortured to accept the love of a woman, man, and I have no need for human companionship. And he's just real cranky about it. And then he kind of storms out the tavern. Now, either accidentally or on purpose, Pickman leaves his ghoul painting in the tavern after he storms off. Like a one-night stand leaving their sweater in your apartment. So they have to come back and get it, like, even though you told them to get lost. You know what I mean? So Mavis snags the painting, goes back home, and then she has a talk with her Uncle George, who's actually played by Donald Moffat, also known as M.T. Gary from John Carpenter's The Thing. He was also Rem in the Logan's Run TV series. So there's that. He's been in a million things. So he knows all about all these monster legends. And he says he thinks he knows roughly where Pickman's studio might be based on the painting that Mavis bought that was from his studio window. You know what I mean? He's like, yeah, I think I know about where that is. So he tells Mavis, you know, that's a real rough part of town. But she's like, fuck it, I'm going down there anyway. So she goes down there anyway because, you know, she's got gumption. So she is just bound and determined also to offer her feminine charms to Pickman, whether he wants them or not. So when she gets there, unsurprisingly, the place is just creepy and dank as shit. It's just, there's rats scurrying everywhere. Also, alarmingly, there's kind of a big growly monster sort of skulking around in the shadows. So she doesn't actually notice that right away. So she gets up to Pickman's studio and is pretty horrified to find a bunch of canvases that have the same monster, like, doing all kinds of terrible things. Like, there's one where he's carrying this woman in a white dress, and there's one where it looks like he's eating somebody, I think. There's also another portrait of the woman in the white dress, and she's standing next to what appears to be her son, who looks like a younger version of Pickman. And then the monster's face is kind of half visible in the background. So from this, you're led to assume that Pickman's mother was one of the women carried off by the monster and used for breeding. Hence, Pickman himself is obviously half monster. Now, this is actually confirmed later in a blink and you'll miss it kind of thing, where he takes off one of his gloves or it gets pulled off or something like that, and he, you know, really, really briefly, and his hand looks kind of scaly. Like, if you blink, you'll miss it. Like I said, it's just, but that's what it means. So Pickman comes home and finds Mavis in his studio, much to his chagrin. And then he goes out in the hall and he tries to calm the monster down because the monster has started like, oh, I need to get in there. You know what I mean? It's a lady. I need to breed. So I guess. So he's I'm going to put you back down in the basement and all this other stuff. But he can't like wrangle him, you know? So the monster busts into the studio and tries to attack Mavis. So Pigman gets in there and him and the monster fight for a while. And then they both fall over a railing, like down to the first floor. Now this kills Pigman, but doesn't really seem to hurt the monster at all. So in all of the brouhaha, Mavis is actually able to escape. And then later on, she brings her Uncle George back to the studio, and then they hire a crew to seal off the well in the basement where the monster was coming out. Because like I said, he lived in tunnels under the city, so that's how he was coming out. And then we come back to the present day with the two art collector people, and they're like, okay, well, this must absolutely be Pickman's painting, and if this one's here, then maybe all of his other missing ones are here too. So they look around and they can't find anything. And so they become convinced that all of the paintings must be hidden in this mysterious bricked up well down in the cellar. And they do kind of like acknowledge why would anybody put a bunch of paintings in a bricked up well in the cellar? Because, you know, it seems kind of dumb. But the other guy just is like, well, we've looked everywhere else. You know what I mean? So, you know, kind of cue the pickaxe hitting the brick. And then there's kind of a growl and a brief shot of the monster eyes, and then it fades to black, so you know how that's going to turn out. So this was a pretty good Lovecraft adaptation all around. It deviated quite a bit from the original story. In the original story, at least from what I can recall, nobody got attacked by a live monster. I don't think anybody saw a live monster. I think the narrator just found a photograph of the monster that Pickman had been using as a reference. I think that was like the big shocker moment. But in this one, I think the changes made were, you know, obviously in service to making it more exciting and cinematic. I mean, obviously it's a lot more exciting having a live monster running around attacking people than just finding a picture of one. I also liked the addition of the female kind of love interest character. I think, you know, it allowed for kind of more conflict and more of an emotional core, like higher stakes. And I will say, like I said, I kind of wish that the monster had been kept more in the shadows. It was actually a decent costume. Especially if for a TV show of this era and this budget, but I don't think they should have showed it as much. I think they could have just kept it more shadowed, even though it's a pretty cool looking suit, you know, for the limitations that they had. I'll also say that the frame story with the two art collectors, I think they probably should have cut that out. Even though that was the closest aspect to the source material, it just didn't really need to be in there. It didn't really add anything to the story as a whole. It was just kind of like a frame at the beginning and end, and it was just not the bulk of the story, so it wasn't necessary. But I mean, overall, I liked this quite a bit. And it was actually somewhat more faithful than the more recent adaptation, because if you didn't know, like Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities on Netflix, there was an adaptation of this story on there as well, which was actually pretty decent. It had Crispin Glover in it, which is always a plus. But this one is a little bit more faithful than that one, because that one took a lot of liberties too. You kind of have to, because like I said, the story is pretty short. So the next segment was called The Dear Departed. And this one had a seance in it. And so you just know that was going to be like right on my wavelength, because I love seance stories. Now, you could tell where the story was going to go, like from a mile off, but it was still pretty good. And it kept humor to a minimum, thankfully. So I appreciated that. So the story was written by Rod Serling and directed by Jeff Corey. So who you have on this one, this is so funny. Steve Lawrence is in this. If you're not old like I am, Steve Lawrence was a very famous lounge singer and comedian. I think he was on the Carol Burnett show, I want to say, like a lot, because he used to be everywhere. Like you should see him all over. Anytime there was some kind of like cheese dick like TV show, like back in the 70s, the show was on it. So Steve Lawrence is in this, but he's playing like a straight role. He's being serious. So he plays Mark Bennett, who is a fraudulent medium, which, you know, they don't make any other kind, but you know what I mean. Now he kind of operates under the name Radha Ramadi, because of course he does. Now, at the beginning, he's conducting a seance, and he's using his spirit guide, Running Deer, because he's one of those, to contact the deceased daughter of one of the people at the seance. Now, even though all of the ghostly accoutrements that are happening at this seance are very obviously fake, I mean, Running Deer's tambourine is just flying around a piece of thread, obviously, and the ghost is just like a very obvious mannequin head, like with streamers hanging down. And that's a stand-in for the dead child that they're supposedly contacting, whose name is Dory. Everyone still totally falls for it. And especially after the spirit of Dory, the dead kid, like drops her beloved stuffed elephant on the table in front of her mom. Now, after the seance, the mom is just so appreciative that she hands Mark a check for $500. And Mark is very good at like pretending he doesn't want it. Like he's just like, oh no, I don't use my gift for money and blah blah blah. And you know that what a crock that is, but you know what I mean. But then in the end, he's just, well, if you really want to give it to me, I'll take it in the spirit which was given or whatever. And I'm just like, yeah, he's pretty slick, this guy. So after everybody leaves, Mark and his two co-conspirators, he has like a prop guy named Joe and Joe's wife Angela, who does kind of the ghostly voices and all of the other stuff that he's doing. They're kind of gloating about how much money they're going to make by, basically taking all of these wealthy suckers for all they're worth, right? Now, Joe, the prop guy, he seems to be having some self-confidence issues, though. Like, they kind of imply, or they kind of explain that him and Mark both came from the Carney circuit, but Mark is way more suave and smart and sophisticated, and Joe is kind of like a more rough and ready, like working class type of dude. So he tells Mark, I'm really not sure I'm ready for the big time. I'm like, I'm afraid I'm going to fuck this up and I'm going to ruin the gig by doing something stupid or messing something up, and I'm going to ruin something for everybody. So they kind of have this long conversation about it, but then finally Mark is able to convince Joe, you're the best damn seance prop faker out there, and I wouldn't be able to do any of this without you. So that seems to mollify him, and he very happily goes to set up the next day's seance, right? Now, after he's gone, Mark and Angela start talking probably too loudly because, Joe's just really in the next room, honestly. But they're talking about the affair that they're very clearly having. So Angela is saying, I'm not really sure how much longer I can stay married to Joe. He's constantly up my ass. It's like I can't even go to the damn hair salon without the dude sitting there in the corner watching me. And she's feeling a little bit suffocated. It doesn't seem like he's, at least I think according to the way that they're trying to portray his personality, it's not that he's like a controlling, abusive jerk. It's that he's so insecure that he's afraid he's going to lose her, like if she's out of his sight for more than a minute. You know what I mean? So he's always just kind of like, or does she still love me? Does she, it's that kind of thing more than being abusive or controlling, but it's controlling in a different way. You know what I mean? So Mark says, look, we're going to make all kinds of money, and then we can cut Joe loose, like, at a later date after we've made all the money, you know what I mean? But Angela isn't really sure she can wait that long. So she also thinks that Joe might suspect that her and Mark are in love, and she's kind of, like, afraid of what he might do. Like I said, he seems like an affable enough guy, but he's very insecure, so, there's no telling how he might react. So later that evening, the three of them go to dinner together. Now, Mark and Angela had actually planned to send Joe to the movies by himself after dinner so they could have some alone time, if you know what I mean. But Joe is, like, not having it. It's like, no, we all have to go to the movies together. Who's going to watch my popcorn when I, or who's going to watch my seat when I go get more popcorn or whatever? It's like, what fun is it going to the movies alone? Like, he doesn't seem suspicious that they're fucking. He just seems, like, baffled. Like, why wouldn't you want to go? It's like, we're all going to have a good time. Now, because Angela complained about a headache, like to try to get out of the movie date, I have a headache, I want to go home, you know what I mean? Joe is like, oh, I know, I'll just run across the street from the restaurant, like over to the pharmacy, and I'll get you some aspirin, and then we can all go, yay, you know what I mean? So Mark and Angela kind of look at each other, like after he leaves, seeing their romantic evening going up in a puff of smoke, right? But then, fate happens to intervene. Now, it seems like 5 seconds, like after Joe steps out of the restaurant, a cop comes into the restaurant looking for Angela and tells her, hey, your husband just got creamed by a truck, and is basically like a crimson stain on the crosswalk. So, sorry. But the two of them are like, oh no, what? But then secretly they're like, when? You know what I mean? It's just kind of, they're like, wow. It was like super quick. It was just really funny. So at the next seance, which I guess is the next day, they didn't really say. So Mark is kind of fretting a little bit because, like, well, Joe isn't here to do all his cool prop shit, and Mark is afraid that him and Angela aren't going to be able to pull off a convincing seance without his help, you know what I mean? Because there's a lot of bells and whistles that have to be, sometimes literally, that have to be done. Angela's like, no, it's going to be fine. We don't need him. But after the guests arrive and like the festivities begin or whatever, the props do start malfunctioning. Like the tambourine crashes to the table and the ghostly voices are all messed up and distorted. Like the tape starts to get eaten and all this other kind of shit. So the people at the seance are starting to think all of this might be fake after all, which, yeah. But then a real ghostly voice starts calling Mark's name. And then there's like a phantom scent of cigar smoke that like wafts into the room. So, as everyone who is not an idiot has already figured out, Joe's ghost has showed up at the seance because he promised that he was always going to be there to help out his best friend, Mark. So now, Mark and Angela, who had just wanted Joe out of the way so they could continue with their adultery, are stuck with his spirit form forever in some kind of like weird menage a trois. So I'm just like, hope Joe likes to watch. So yeah, I actually liked this one quite a bit. The twist wasn't really surprising at all, like you knew where it was going to go. But I didn't really mind because it was still a fun story. And the acting, actually, especially from Steve Lawrence, who I thought was great in this, but it was like real solid. I really do have a kind of a soft spot for fake seance type stories, so this one kind of pushed all my buttons. Although again, it wasn't really scary. It wasn't overtly funny, but it wasn't like really scary either, but it was still like pretty fun. So another little funny vignette here, and you can tell just by the little sigh of resignation in my voice how I feel about these. This one is called An Act of Chivalry, written and directed by Jack Laird. This has no dialogue really, and it's less than 2 minutes long. And again, it's just kind of a why bother kind of entry. So there's a bunch of business people in an elevator, and a woman gets on, and all of the men take their hats off. Because that, in case you're real young, that used to be the polite custom. Like a woman walks in the room, everybody takes their hats off when everybody wore hats, which obviously people don't really anymore. So at the next floor, a new person gets on the elevator. It's just this tall figure in what looks like Elizabethan type dress, like a cloak and stuff. And when he turns around, he's just like a walking skeleton, essentially. Now, nobody in the elevator seems at all fazed that the Grim Reaper basically has just kind of entered their midst, right? And one of the guys actually kind of knits his brow and gestures to the Grim Reaper that he needs to take his hat off because there's a lady present. He doesn't say anything, but he just like gestures, like, you know what I mean? So Grim, he kind of like looks at the lady and like nods very apologetically, like, oh, sorry about that. And then he takes off his whole skull, hat and all. Comedy, yeah. Again, I'm not really sure what the point of these little interludes was. Now, I do admit that I thought it was funny that a tall skeleton man got on an elevator and everyone was just mad about it. Like, that kind of cracked me up. Because for some reason, wild shit happening or, like, bizarre shit happening and everyone just being like, huh, is, like, really, really funny to me. So that was funny. But other than that, it's just like I didn't really see the point of this at all. So episode 12. Now, the first segment of this is yet another Lovecraft adaptation. This one of probably a even more famous short story, which is called Cool Air, which has been adapted lots and lots and lots of times. So again, this was directed by the Jaws 2 guy, whose name I can't pronounce, and was adapted, like with the teleplay, was by Rod Serling. And this one is pretty faithful to the original story, made a couple of changes. And I think the acting performances are good, but it does seem like a little bit inert. Like, it seems like a little bit dull, like especially in the middle section, which I think probably could have been cut out. So Barbara Rush is in this, and she plays a woman named Agatha Howard. Now, her dad was a scientist and was a colleague of this doctor named Dr. Juan Munoz at MIT. So Agatha's father has died, and she was going through his letters and she came across all this correspondence from Dr. Munoz that fascinated her. So she decides she's going to go visit him, like at his boarding house. Now, the character of Agatha was not in the original story. It was actually told, the original story was actually told from the point of view of I believe a male narrator that moved into the same boarding house as the doctor. But, just as in the previous adaptation of Pickman's model that we talked about, I'm not going to quibble with the added conflict, which was added by making the character like a potential love interest, you know what I mean? So just as in the original story, Dr. Munoz has been working on kind of foregoing death or staving off death in some manner. And he tells Agatha that he has a condition that means that he has to keep his apartment at like 50 odd degrees, like it has to be cold in there all the time. and he keeps it at that temperature with the help of like a refrigeration machine of his own design. And he insists that he can't leave. Like, his apartment is climate controlled and he can't go out of it or he'll die. So Agatha is kind of initially put off by the cold, as you would be. He's like, hey, I've got coats and stuff if you want to be in the apartment or whatever. But I mean, she slowly kind of starts to fall in love with him. So, you know, she doesn't mind going there. And like I said, he has coats for her to wear and blah, blah, blah. Now, in the middle of the segment, there's kind of like long scenes of them having dinner together and having, you know, philosophical discussions and discussions about art and Munoz's research and stuff like that. But that's really neither here nor there. It doesn't really contribute to the story too much. So like I said, that part drags a little bit. But at some point after Agatha and Dr. Munoz have gotten close, there's a bad storm and it knocks out the power to the boarding house, which, of course, you know, interferes with the running of Munoz's refrigeration unit. So Munoz is in there banging around in the flat, like trying to get the thing going again, like at 3 a.m, and he's keeping everybody in the building awake. So he's panicking. He calls Agatha, and Agatha rushes over there, and she says she's going to help him find somebody who fixed the machine. Now, it so happens that a dude that lives in the building is a mechanic, but he comes in and looks at the machine, and he's like, look, I can't do anything with this until the parts store opens up in the morning because I need a part, and we don't have it. So Munoz is kind of like shit out of luck. Now, ominously, when Agatha and the mechanic are in the apartment, Dr. Munoz is pretty much completely covered with like this white hooded robe, and he just has like one eye poking out, so you can't really see any of his face. So you're like, uh-oh. So at this point, he's kind of running out of options. So Munoz says to Agatha through the closed door of the apartment, it's like, I need ice and lots of it. So she actually manages to get 300 pounds of the stuff to like delivered to the place and presumably dumped in his bathtub. So this seems to work for a little while, but, you know, it starts to melt, and Munoz can't stop the temperature from rising above, you know, 50 odd degrees or whatever. And he knows that he's a goner because he can't get his machine fixed. Now, at this point comes the revelation. He finally confesses to Agatha through the door that he actually died 10 years ago. Now, in the story, it was 18 years ago, but, you know, whatever, close enough. And that he had been keeping himself alive by, he's essentially cryogenically preserved while still being able to like walk around like a living person. You know what I mean? But he is dead. And so as he dies, again, like for the second time, Agatha busts into the apartment and just sees his horrible looking withered corpse like lying on the floor, which is actually like a pretty good effect. And she just like screams and screams and screams her bloody head off. And that's like pretty much the end of it. So other than like the gender swap of the narrator character and the addition of this little romance subplot, this was actually a pretty close approximation of the original story. Again, you have to kind of flesh out a lot of Lovecraft stories because a lot of them were pretty short. But despite that, I kind of felt like it went on a little bit too long. I think there was like, especially in the middle part, there were too many unneeded conversations. I didn't really need that whole segment with them having all those discussions about whatnot. You just needed to get to the monster shit, you know what I mean? But, you know, that said, this is still like a decent Lovecraft adaptation, and at least like took the material seriously, which I always appreciate. So the next segment is called Camera Obscura, and this is adapted from another short story that I'm actually was already very familiar with. This story was originally written by Basil Copper, and it appeared in one of my favorite horror anthologies, which I've mentioned numerous times before, Alfred Hitchcock Presents Stories That Scared Even Me. That's where I first read this when I was a kid, and I've read it numerous times since then. But this, again, the teleplay was written by Rod Serling, and this one was actually directed by John Badham, who, as I'm sure I've mentioned before, later directed Saturday Night Fever, also the 1979 version of Dracula that had Frank Langella in it, and War Games with Matthew Broderick. So there's that, same director. So this adaptation actually follows the source story very, very closely. Except I believe, I haven't read it in a while, but I think like the ending is fleshed out a little bit more. But other than that, it's almost exactly like the story. So Ross Martin plays Mr. Gingold, who's this kind of addled but sort of lovable old man. And he lives in this house, and he has this fantastic collection of antiques and artwork and all this other stuff. Now, Rene Auberjonois, who I knew from the old Benson show, he plays Mr. Sharsted, who is this kind of officious moneylender type dude. And he comes to Gingold's house to remind him that he's owed 300 pounds as repayment on a loan. Like, in a few days, you know, he's going to have that 300 pounds, please and thank you. Now, Gingold doesn't really seem all that concerned about money. And, Sharstead is kind of snotty about it. He just wants to get down to business or whatever. But Gingold is like, no, I got to show you all this cool shit that I have in my house. He's like, look, this is an original painting by Constable. And I'm like, holy crap, that's probably like $1 million. But yeah, and Sharstead said the same thing. Wow, if you put that up at auction, you'd probably get like a lot of money for that. But Gingold is like, well, I don't want to sell it. Or just like, he doesn't really want to sell anything, like even to pay his loans back, which is kind of at the core of the issue. Is what we're talking about here. One of the things that Gingold is very keen to show Sharstead is a Victorian era camera obscura. And this gives a kind of a panoramic view of the whole city. Like, it's inside the house, but because it has all these prisms and lenses and mirrors and shit on it, like, you can see this big panoramic, like, just on this little plate glass, you know what I mean, that you look down at. Now, Sharstead looks at this, and he has to admit he's pretty impressed. Like, it's pretty cool, right? But he's still getting kind of impatient. Like, is Gingold going to have the 300 pounds on Monday, or what? Or, like, what's going on? Now, Gingold just, like, evades that whole issue. And instead, he kind of starts haranguing Sharstead about him being, like, essentially a usurer. And also kind of gets on his case about his recent decision to kick this old man named Mr. Thwaite out of his house for not keeping up with his mortgage payments. So Sharstead is basically like, hey, if you can't afford the shit, then you can't stay in the shit. You can't like stay in the shit for free. So and then he tells Gingold, it's like, maybe you should be worrying about your own like money problems, because man, you also owe me 300 pounds, which, like I said, was a lot of money back then. So Gingold asked Sharstead kind of ominously, well, will you reconsider giving Mr. Thwaite a break on his mortgage? Sharstead's like, fuck no. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm a money lender. I lent him money. He didn't pay it back. So out on his ass he goes. So at that point, Gingold is like, okay, well, then there's one more thing I want to show you. And it's really cool. It's also a camera obscura, but it's a real rare one. Gingold's like, fine. Okay, whatever. So they go down and look at it. Now, when Gingold shows Sharstead the city through this particular device, Sharstead is very surprised to see the same city. Like, it's a lot, like it's moving around, like you're really looking at it. But the city looks like it did when he was a kid, like a long time ago. Like, there are gas street lamps, there are buildings that he knows burned down when he was little, and stuff like that. So this is starting to make him a little bit nervous. He's like, wow, that's pretty weird. But then he kind of like scoffs. He's like, you're just fucking with me. You're just playing a trick. It's like some kind of magic lantern illusion or something like that. And Gingold is all, you just keep on thinking that, buddy. And then Sharstead's like, all right, well, just pay me back. I'm coming back on Monday, and you have to have the money. And I've said my piece about it, so bye. So he leaves. But when Sharstead gets back out in the street, he is horrified to discover that he's been transported back in time, like to what he was looking at in the camera obscura. And not only that, but everybody he comes across is somebody that he wronged in some way throughout his life. And I think it was also people that his family wronged, because I think they imply that like his whole family was, usurious. Am I saying that right? Money lenders, like they lent out money at like horrible rates of interest and all this other kind of stuff. Like they're real shit sticks, you know what I mean? So all of these people are like coming at him. And so, since all of these people have subsequently died, they all look like kind of creepy zombies, and they're all like coming after him for fucking them over. So Sharstead like flips out and tries to run away from them, but he's kind of like trapped in this hellish past, like forever, you're led to assume. So like I said, this was like a really good adaptation of the short story. I don't remember zombie people chasing Sharstead at the end of the original story, but I didn't mind that addition because it kind of made the story like more horrific, you know what I mean? It gave it like more of a punchier ending. But other than that, it was almost like identical to the written story. And I have to say, like, I enjoyed it quite a bit. Like the back and forth between the two actors was really, really good. So the last bit of episode 12, another super short, pointless segment called Quoth the Raven. Now this one was written by Jack Laird, directed by Jeff Corey. Now, it concerns, obviously, Edgar Allan Poe, who actually misspells his own name as Edgar Allan Poe with an E instead of the correct A. But Edgar Allan Poe is played by Marty Allen with an E. So I was like, maybe that's the joke? Or maybe it's because I know that a lot of people misspell Edgar Allan Poe's name, A-L-L-E-N, but it's A-L-L-A-N is the correct spelling. So I don't know if they misspelled it on purpose because the name of the actor was Allen with an E. I don't know. Or were they thinking about it that much? I'm probably thinking about it more than they did. So that's neither here nor there. So Edgar Allan Poe is in his study working on his iconic poem, obviously the Raven. Now he gets the first line set down. You know, you can tell he's like having writer's block. Once upon a midnight dreary, you know what I mean? And then he then can't think of a word that rhymes with dreary. And he just keeps going, dreary, Miri, Siri, you know what I mean? It's like that kind of thing. And then finally, the Raven on the bust of Pallas above the chamber door and all of that just squawks out, weary, dummy, in a voice that sounds almost exactly like Daffy Duck. Also, apropos of nothing, it seems that Edgar has a portrait of someone who I'm pretty sure is Lizzie Borden framed over his mantelpiece. Maybe not, but I was pretty sure that's that famous portrait of Lizzie Borden. Go watch it and see. I was pretty sure it was, and I'm just like, why does he have a picture of Lizzie Borden over his fireplace? But yeah, this whole thing, again, stop trying to be funny, Night Gallery. Stop it. It just looks dumb, and it's like a complete waste of 2 minutes. I don't know why they bothered with these, and I know I say that every single time, but it's just baffling. All right, so that will finally do it for these 6 episodes. Hope you guys enjoyed this very long, tumultuous journey that we've been on together. Can't believe how long this video turned out, but you know how I do. I just go on and on. So yeah, but yeah, I'm gonna keep doing these like in 6-episode chunks. I'm still working on Boris Karloff's Thriller as well, which I'm also doing in 6-episode chunks whenever I get time to do it. So I might do that one next, but we'll see. But whenever I get around to doing the next 12, you know, or the next 6, then you'll know. So yeah, thanks for watching. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and all of that good stuff. And I'll see you guys in the salon next time. Bye.